And today we are here to talk about Christian supremacy, about the right to religion of LGBTIQ people, particularly in Africa, and about a brilliant piece that my colleague Arya, who's on this call, wrote for us last week, and which I've had the absolute joy of spending a bunch of time over the last month or so working with Arya on. I'm Adam Ramsay, I'm an editor at openDemocracy, and you are all very welcome on our weekly call, and it's a great pleasure to have you all. You should know that you have, I know some of you have put in questions already, and I've had a chance to read those, so thank you for that. There's also the chat box, and if you're not familiar, then find it in the bottom of your screen and do type things into it. Do send us comments and questions, and let us know where you've come from. Do give us a wave. It's always nice to hear from you. We usually have people from all around the world. Please also know that we are all in our own homes. Chrissy tells me that she's got a dog in there. I have locked myself in my front hall, which is this size, partly because it's got some great rainbow wallpaper behind me, and I wanted to match Arya's lovely flag behind her, but also because the dog has got the massive sitting room next door, and the chances that he goes crazy are quite high. So apologies if things go off rails because of that, or if any of us lose Wi-Fi or connection. That's the way.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I don't really have a better background that I can use. So
your background is wonderful. We like to think that we offer people a glimpse of reality on these conversations, sort of airbrush version that you get on some news shows. So so no need to apologise. And let me introduce our lovely panel. And what I've told them is basically I'm going to hope that they're just going to chat. So we've just heard from Chrissy Stroop. Hi, Chrissy.
Hello.
And you are in Portland, Oregon.
Correct.
And you're a mile and a half from where people are getting tear gassed recently and so on. So quite a lot of intensity. And we're going to hear a bit more about your background soon. Next on my stream, we have got my colleague Arya Karijo. Now you are in Nairobi, Arya?
Yes, I am.
And Arya has just finished a fellowship with openDemocracy. If you haven't read her brilliant piece, Don't Queer Kenyans Have a Right to Religion Too, then I would absolutely encourage you to read it, but you're going to hear lots more about it today. And we have the Reverend Alba Onofrio. Have I pronounced your name correctly?
Perfectly, amazing.
Great. And you are interviewed at length in the piece, you both are, and you are from a group called Soulforce, so I'm going to ask you about in a moment. In fact, let's start with you, Alba. So Soulforce says it exists to sabotage Christian supremacy through radical analysis, healing, and strategic direct action. And that's one of those sentences where, like, we could spend the whole hour talking about every word in it. But can you just give us a quick description of what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, we should start by what is Christian supremacy such that we want to sabotage it. It is the idea that there is co-optation, that there is a taking of Christianity and using it like a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? To use the language, the sacred text, the tradition, to cause harm, to perpetuate domination, imperialism, racism, sexism, etc. And that mixture, that marriage, that unholy union between power, systems of power, and religion, we call that Christian supremacy. And that is something that must go, because as people of faith, like myself, we need to take God back from this idea that God is about punishment, death, evil, harm, particularly against the most marginalized communities. And so part of the way we do that is by healing our own religious trauma and the spiritual violence that have been done against us as women, as LGBT people, as immigrants, etc. So that's where the healing part comes in. We go deep into the Bible, deep into the tradition, deep into the text, and without fear, we look at what God has to tell us within that text. And then strategically, we work on where it is in the world where Christianity is being used to withhold or deny rights of marginalized communities, individuals, and we work with activists and groups and churches on the ground in different places around the world to try to make it better, to try to change it, to try to stop allowing Christianity to be used as a scapegoat or as the reason why harm can come to our most beloved communities.
And that all sounds wonderful, and it feels like a very different version of Christianity from perhaps the kind which Arya describes being excluded from in her piece. So Arya, I suppose my question for you is, how has it been for you going from that feeling that you couldn't go to your church to beginning to meet people like Alba and the others you describe in your article, the churches you describe who you feel might be more welcoming to you? I think you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm not sure if I should describe how it has been for me, but I know for this particular piece, I interviewed, in Kenya, we have a community group called Queer Hive, and it's a group of LGBTQ women, feminists, and for this piece, I interviewed a lot of them. And one of them wrote to me today saying, like, you know, the piece gave us so much more clarity. It gave them so much clarity. It gave them hope, and she thanked me for it. And you know, that really moved me, because it also describes my own search for, you know, because this whole, I mean, exclusion in itself, like being pushed out of church, is not such a bad, doesn't feel like such a bad thing. But what feels terrible is that you feel like you're a wrong kind of human being. And I think that's what happens to a lot of queer people. And so when I interviewed Chrissy and Alba for this, and you know, just seeing this whole other possibility that, you know, maybe I'm not a wrong kind of human being. Maybe someone took something that was supposed to be for my good, that was supposed to make me feel like, you know, child of God or child of the universe, and made it feel like, you know, I don't belong. Yeah, so it's like a whole 360 transformation.
Oh, well, I can tell you that we all think you belong and we think you're awesome. And thank you so much for working with us. It's been a total pleasure. And Chrissy, you describe yourself, I think, as an ex-evangelical. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, it's a term obviously defined against something rather than in terms of what I am now. But I grew up evangelical. I grew up in this kind of white supremacist, patriarchal, anti-LGBTQ Christianity. And now I'm a non-believer. I have some room perhaps in my worldview, even though I don't like the term worldview very much, for mystery, perhaps. I won't claim to know exactly one way or another about questions of God and whatnot, but I also haven't seen any compelling evidence of God, and so I don't believe in God, and I don't mind these days being described as an atheist, but I usually don't use the term myself because it has so much baggage from the new atheist movement, which is very much Protestant-inflected Christian atheism that perpetuates the, you know, imperialism and white supremacy in another form. So I really kind of can't stand the rationaler than thou atheists. And in my in my recent work, I have been trying to do what I can to advocate for pluralism and moral autonomy, and for building coalitions of believers and non-believers around shared values. So I always emphasize that shared values are much more important than shared beliefs. And things that I value include equality for all, democracy, kindness, moral autonomy, and so forth. So, you know, I want to make sure that there's always a seat at the table for the non-believers and the people who, you know, we may have been forced out of religion. I would say, in a sense, that, yeah, I tried for quite some time, you know, after seriously deconstructing, about a decade and a half or even a little more, to hold on to Christianity in some form. And it became inauthentic to me to do so. But the term ex-evangelical is just kind of used, or ex-evangelical or ex-V is used to describe people who come from this background and they haven't all taken the same paths out. Some people land in better religion, some people land in no religion at all. And I think that we all need to be validated. And so, you know, any dismantling of Christian supremacism has to include full equal rights and participation for non-believers. But non-believers do ourselves no favors if we simply throw out a kind of ignorant and unnuanced anti-theism based on a Protestant definition of religion. But one thing that is important to me is not to say that, you know, this kind of imperialist Christianity is fake. It is one very real version of the faith. It is religion. Sometimes domination is what religion is, but not always. And I want to talk to and work with the people who, you know, have a better kind of Christianity, a liberationist Christianity, that want to alienate them.
And I was going to ask you more about imperialism, but I feel like actually that's quite a good segue to go back to Alba. And you know, I feel like you're introduced in the piece as an example of such a person, and you know, developing new ideas of liberation theology. I think that, you know, a lot of us are kind of perhaps familiar with liberation theology as something that comes from Latin America and is sort of inflected towards Catholicism, and you know, in the past. But a new wave of liberation theology is, you know, feels like something you're exploring. And so I wondered if you could tell us, you know, what that means to you and what tradition you come from, perhaps, but where you're going, more importantly.
Yeah, thank you. Well, my mother's family was Roman Catholic, is Roman Catholic. My father's family is Southern Baptist, which is a very fundamentalist, Christian evangelical fundamentalist community. I am in the southeast of the United States, and that community is very strong here. And so I was raised in this part of the world. I got a lot of Bible. I got a lot of wonderful theology that taught me things that I couldn't unlearn even when I was no longer welcome in the church. Things like God was as close as my own breath, like Jesus loves me, this I know, a ton of things that just stuck, and for better, for worse, and I believe for better at this point. I couldn't let them go. So I definitely still identify as evangelical. My message is different, but the outcome is no less urgent. I am someone who believes in going deep and believing in a God who is bigger. So for me, maybe liberation theology is overstepping. I would say rather the group of people that I am in community with, believers, non-believers, activists most particularly, are people who work toward liberating theologies. And of those, there are as many as I would say there are humans who want to engage in it. We do it in our everyday lives. I think what I wanted to say back to you, Chrissy, because I thought it was so beautiful what you were talking about around how do you leave space for the other and yet hold true and make sure that there's space for you. And I think for me, when we talk about Christianity, so often we create the markers or the standards of what is allowed or what is good or what is faithful or what is holy somewhere else. We put it on the pastor, on the priest, on the Bible. And what is true is that though the Bible may be inspiration of God, it requires the minds and voices of human beings to interpret that into anything that is meaningful. And so where Soulforce works, we have something called an ethics of life. We are not a faith-based organization. I am an ordained clergy in an interfaith tradition and local church here where I am. And most of my ministry is with LGBTIQ activists and defenders of human rights. So I'm a little bit because I'm not ordainable in most religious and Christian denominations. But I would say that there's this thing that we have in common, which is theology which leads to death is bad, period. Biblical text that is used to lead to harm is bad, period. End of discussion, because we know that everything must be interpreted. And anyone who tells you that you can just pick up a Bible and there it is in black and white in some language other than the original text was written in, it's a lie that you can just read it and know what it says. It is absolutely true that as people, we can read and we have our own interpretations of what that means and what it means to us. And I believe that the Spirit can move through the text and through ritual, through church, to speak to our hearts and our souls. But it is a lie that it just exists always plainly, clearly, and without interpretation. So what do we do then if there's this way of thinking that says homosexuality is awful, there's this way of thinking that says homosexuality is a gift from the divine that should be celebrated, totally embraced and loved? That would be my opinion. And the same thing with trans people, with immigrants, with et cetera, et cetera. How do we decide between those two ways of thinking? And for me, it is the same thing that you were saying, Chrissy, which is ethics is how we decide. We take responsibility for the implications of our belief. So if my beliefs as a Christian cause harm to other people, cause death, they take away human rights or human dignity, those are not justifiable. Those are not ethical beliefs. And what you're saying, what I hear you saying, Chrissy, is like the opposite is true, that you don't need to be a believer in order to believe in ethics and have a system of morality that says life and equality and life abundant is what we are doing. And so for me, I would come at that same position to say, in my opinion, God is a God of life who struggles and fights for life on the planet in spite of some humans' best efforts. And so therefore, that God of life must be honored by supporting theologies and interpretations of biblical text that also honor and support life, period.
Yeah, I if I may respond, yeah, I actually absolutely agree on, you know, the topic of bad theology or toxic or authoritarian theology. I like Kevin Miguel Garcia's slogan, "Bad theology kills," right? So I agree with you on that. And, you know, there's a certain level on which I can appreciate that theologies like yours, find something beautiful in them, where at the same time, I just can't see for myself that vision of God. God is always a divine abuser in the sky to me who doesn't exist, because if that God exists, he's not worth worshiping. In fact, we should object to him on moral grounds. And just know, you know, this liberationist version of God just doesn't resonate with me. But obviously it means a lot to you, and that's okay. And we have ethics-based values in which we can work together, you know? So yeah, absolutely.
And I was wondering if we could chat a bit about the thing that in a way brings you all together, which is, you know, because for Arya, if I can summarize your experience, you were wondering where this kind of version of Christianity had come from. And that led you ultimately back to the Bible Belt, back to the USA, and to this sort of imperialist ideology of America. And then before that to, you know, to the UK and to where I'm from and where I am now. But I think for lots of people, certainly where I am in Britain, the kind of the understanding of the power of that particular kind of evangelical Christian supremacy, as you might describe it, has only really arrived in the last 4 years with the election of Trump. And I think, you know, for a lot of people, that's been quite a new experience in America. We knew that there was a kind of Christianity in the Bible Belt, but the idea that it had that kind of power, I think, was new to people. And so I suppose my question is, and I'm going to start with Arya, but then I'd love to hear all of you kind of reflect on this. You know, like, where's that come from, and what's it for? You know, so for Arya, you know, when did it arrive in your country? What do you think it is doing there, and what function is it playing in our global system?
Well, so I mean, my search begins with a court ruling. So it's the LGBT community in Kenya go to court, and they put forward this case that, you know, we need this particular law in the penal code removed because it gives police officers an excuse to arbitrarily arrest and mostly extort money. I mean, a lot of them do not actually take you to court, but they'll put you in the cells or, you know, hold you for a couple of hours until you give up cash. And so the LGBT community was like, you know, this law is there for exploitation, it's pretty vague, and it came from the colonizer. So it came from the British. And the exact same law, if you read the law in Kenya, which talks about carnal knowledge, it's, well, I mean, if it affect, it's actually a pretty amusing sentence, because it talks about unnatural acts and carnal knowledge. But the funny thing, in exactly every colony, in India, in Botswana, in every colony the British occupied, the exact same law is used. And so for us, what happened, the judge ruled, and they kept us for 3 hours. And I mean, they could have summed it up and said, Kenya is a Christian nation, and we know we are supposed to, you know, you people are not allowed in a Christian nation. That would have been the summary of it. And so this whole idea of Christianity, when someone feels that they are better morally, if they have some sense of, I'm better than this person, I'm a righteous person, the lesbian, the trans person is evil, then they get some validation to do you harm, to deprive you of rights, and that's what's happening in Kenya. So when the judges made that ruling, I mean, people lauded it. They're like, LGBT people do not deserve this. And I know I had some Facebook arguments after the article came out, and there's people who even quoted Leviticus, so it says you should actually kill someone who has. And the fact that someone who calls themselves a Christian and approves the execution of someone else because they love differently from the way they love, or the agenda is different from theirs. The fact that someone could approve of, execution, and they will credit that to a Christian belief, and that's the danger of it. Once people use Christianity to take that higher moral ground, they excuse evil. And in Kenya, if you step away from what LGBT people have suffered, if you look at our politics, anytime a politician has done something, taken money from public coffers, led to mass killings of citizens, what they do is they turn back to the church. So they have prayers, and bishops pray over them and say they are the anointed leaders of God. And so we have this, I think, like Alba was saying at the beginning, when you have this connection of power and the elite, and you tie it to religion, it becomes very dangerous, because now these people are able to do anything and credit it to God and say, the being up there, like, I don't know, like Chrissy is saying, the dangerous God, has given me permission. And because I'm a Christian, because I practice this, I'm allowed to do this. And that's the thing that's used for. So when people deprive LGBT people of their rights, when the local citizen, when you're walking on the road and they yell insults at you, or they threaten you with violence, they do not feel they are doing something wrong. They feel that they're doing God's work, and that's the danger of it. And then, so that's on the one side. The other side is, a lot of us have grown up. It's very difficult for any person my age, I mean my late 30s, to tell you what African culture looks like. So through colonization, through our education, we've kind of lost that. And so a lot of us were brought up in this Afro-Christian upbringing, and that's the only thing we know. So for a queer person who comes out and they're told they're wrong kind of person, they do not belong to their family or to the church, it's very easy to start hating yourself and feel, maybe they are right, maybe I do not deserve this. And so for my article, one of the big things I was hoping it will inspire is that as long as we are human beings, then we are not a wrong kind of human beings. So just anchoring on that, our humanity is what counts. Our existence is our truth. So that's what I was really hoping a lot of my fellow queer folk will anchor themselves on and start pushing back, either pushing back or taking back religion. But the thing is not giving up and saying maybe society is right, because society is wrong and they based it on a wrong premise, on teachings that were brought through colonization and on teachings that were already twisted. Because, I mean, there was still parts of what was taught to us as early Christianity that justified colonialism. And it's now strange that people will say, when you're protecting these same teachings and these same laws, that you're protecting African culture. It's really messed up. So I think it's important for people to start speaking up. And for me, I found that exploring and going back to the beginnings of this will kind of dent the whole moral authority of people who say, I can discriminate on an LGBT person because this came from God. If I can show it came from Emperor Theodosius in Rome, or King Henry in England, yeah, then I show it, this came from a person, did not come from a divine being. It came from a person fighting his enemies, trying to keep power of an empire, and now you're adopting it as your own African culture and using it to oppress other people. Yeah.
And Chrissy, if we understand that historically, and I think you laid out very well in your piece, Harry, you talk about the way that the Romans used the Bible, the kind of late Romans, you talk about the British Empire and King James. Think about American imperialism now, and the way that a particular kind of evangelism is used to control places, including Kenya, where Arya is.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just talk us through some of the kind of history of that and the role that, you talk very well in the piece about this, and I'd love to hear some more thoughts from you on, specifically the role that evangelical Christianity has played in American imperialism.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Adam. So first, I guess I'll start off by saying there is a long historical thread of what we might call Imperial Christianity that does run through from late antiquity, from the time of Constantine, up to the present, where the current center of that would absolutely be the United States. Previously the most important center of this Christian supremacism, and one that still has a huge impact in places like African countries, would be the British Empire. And of course, it's taken other sort of instantiations as well historically, as Europeans dominated the world and carried out genocide and, did it on the basis of justifications from Christianity. Not to say that, someone like Christopher Columbus was a very pious person, but, the very pious people who got over to the Americas, mostly still played along with the whole game. I mean, you had the occasional Bartolomeo de las Casas, but, not very many of them. And I kind of bring up him and his eventual criticisms of slavery because when you want to talk about the role of evangelicals and Christian supremacism in the United States and how it's being exported today, then you absolutely have to look at the history of the United States as a white supremacist, slave-holding apartheid state. So, slavery formally ended by fiat during the Civil War in 1863, but only on paper, and officially then ending after the war, but was quickly replaced through the actions of white terrorists like the Ku Klux Klan, who undermined the process of Reconstruction and terrorized, killed Black people, people who supported their civil rights and so forth. You end up with a kind of new sort of apartheid system of Jim Crow, which is at its height in early to mid 20th century America before you have the civil rights movement. And I think you're right that when people think of liberation theology, you mentioned earlier, globally, they think of Latin America, but there's also the African-American tradition of liberation theology. Think of people like James H. Cone, who recently died, which is very important in the American context. So to kind of fast forward to the present, well, let's just also say a lot of this is inflected through the Cold War, right? And the lens of anti-communism, which goes very closely together with Christian supremacism in America and to some extent in Europe in the mid to late 20th century. And it's through anti-communism, in fact, that evangelicals of the more fundamentalist variety become so powerful, particularly crystallizing through the 1980 election, where they throw their support to Ronald Reagan, who it's often pointed out is not one of their own. And Jimmy Carter was, and so a lot of people see a sort of certain irony there. But I guess, okay, I also have to back up a little bit here. In the 19th century, there were also evangelical abolitionists. And today you'll see a lot of white evangelicals who want to be respectable trying to kind of claim that heritage of abolitionism. But where white evangelicalism's historical roots today really lie in the United States are far less in abolitionism than they are in slaveholder Christianity. And then in fundamentalism, of the sense of, there were these pamphlets called the Fundamentals that were published starting in 1915 that differentiated, American fundamentalist Christians from the so-called modernist theologians who were trying to push for a sort of more humane social gospel and so forth. Though I think it's also fair to say as indeed I've discussed with African-American pastors and theologians, those white modernist theologians still absolutely lack a theology of race and white supremacism. But nevertheless, the fundamentalists differentiate themselves on all of these things, and they're out of favor after the Scopes trial. But by the 1950s, thanks to the Cold War and their staunch anti-communism, they're back and they start organizing, and eventually they start building coalitions with right-wing Catholics. And so the Christian right in its modern form is often attributed to opposition to the Roe v. Wade ruling in 1973, but really the opposition to abortion is kind of a proxy for white supremacism that they found that they could land on at a time when openly supporting discrimination was no longer politically viable. And it allowed them to come together with Catholics to try to impose domination in the public square, to make conservative Christians more equal than others. I mean, even in 1973 and after, you had many Southern Baptist pastors who saw abortion as a Catholic issue, and they weren't particularly interested in it, or they didn't think it should be illegal at all times. And it's not really until the late 70s that they really get on board with that. And it crystallizes, as I said, in 1980. Now, in more recent years, these white evangelicals, radical traditionalist Catholics, and so forth, have been very worried that they're losing their cultural power, and so they do everything they can to undermine American democracy and hold on to disproportionate power. They're helped by the Electoral College, gerrymandering, but they also engage in a lot of voter suppression at the state level. The American election system is a whole other can of worms. It's an absolute mess. But they have been, through missionary activity, trying to expand their culture wars agenda to the rest of the world. That's been a focus of some research and discussion in recent years. The case of Uganda has particularly gotten a lot of attention, where you have a lot of white American pastors who have their fingers on the so-called kill the gays law. So, you have this coming in kind of on top of that previous British imperial influence, which imposed the original anti-sodomy laws. So yeah, they're trying to expand abroad, but they have also, I think, gained more power than most people expected at home. But I don't see Trump as any kind of break. I see it as just total continuity of what they've been doing for the last 4 or 5 decades. And the American public didn't pay enough attention, the broadly liberal public, and they've won. Hopefully we can start reversing that after this next election. But I moved to Portland, Oregon to get away from this, and now it's still coming for me. Or, I mean, I've been running from it my whole life.
It's everywhere. And Alba, I'm going to come to a question from Simon Hill next. But Alba, just before I do, just to give Simon, if he's definitely there, a chance to prompt himself, can you just tell us a bit about what you might describe as the opposite of that, which the kind of womanist theology which Arya wrote about in her piece, and the work that you've been doing, perhaps to counteract, kind of very different kind of evangelism?
Before I get there, I want to piggyback on something Chrissy was saying, which was this idea that so many Americans and people around the world were surprised by this election of Trump because he is one of the least religious people you'd ever want to see in your whole entire life, both from his example, his words, and his utter lack of basic things like how you pronounce Bible passages or books. What we need to understand is that Christian supremacy is a front for a system of power. And so the reason that Trump was okay was because people were voting for white supremacy. They weren't voting for evangelicalism or even Christianity per se. It is a dog whistle call and response thing that we see happening. So when I say things like purity, it is connected with this, I will be washed white as snow. Well, even the metaphor of white as snow is connected to a racial orientation. It's connected to a class orientation around those of us who have to be in the mud and work and dig in the soil, et cetera, versus those who are elite. So I just want to note exactly that idea that for those of us who have been talking about things like Christian supremacy, about this perpetuation of domination, imperialism, white supremacy, Trump was the obvious voter, was the obvious candidate, not because of his positions around being a faithful Christian, but rather because for generations now, we have had this covert racism that is just really a kind of call and response that has so dominated Christianity. So this kind of, well, the reason we're talking about womanism, I think, is super important because I was so grateful to be able to go to Eastern Africa last year, and Kenya was our last stop, doing a theological conference for women of faith, like lesbian, bisexual, trans, gender nonconforming women in East Africa with a group called the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. And they have lots of connections with folks across Africa, but specifically in East Africa, with including one of the churches that Arya mentioned in her piece. And so it is very important that we recognize that there are these alternative liberating theologies. And one of them that is very important is a womanist tradition. And that is where Black women are centered. The daily lives and experiences are centered as not only important, not only holy, but a place from which one begins to theologize, from where one begins to imagine what God is like. And so when we center marginalized people, and I am Latina and not Black, and therefore I am not a womanist scholar, but I have deep appreciation for womanism and can practice as an ally, can practice a lot of the foundational values, which is that when you center the lives of Black women, you center entire communities. And from that kind of theologizing, we talked a lot about in our conferences, who is God to you? To the community that we are talking with and in. How does God show up in your everyday life? What does it mean about God that God accompanies us or that God is here for us? What does it mean for us as, particularly in those spaces we were talking about being part of the LGBTQI community or umbrella? And so by those kinds of liberating theologies, the same thing, we have a similar tradition in Mujerista, in the Latino and Latina theology that is one step further, that doesn't just say, Black liberation theology initially didn't have as much of a gender analysis, and the same thing with liberation theology. And so it is this next step. Every generation, I feel like we have a feminist coming in who then transform the narratives and offer us deeper analysis. And so womanism, the Wawa Ba conferences that we did, that I was an invited guest to, that happened in Rwanda, Uganda, and Kenya last year, were phenomenal, led by womanist scholars and theologians. And I was grateful enough and delighted to come and talk specifically about Bible work. And it was amazing. The people who are doing this activist work for our community's rights, for our LGBT community and women's rights, are phenomenally strong and powerful, even with less resources than they deserve to be able to move the work forward. Because once you know that you are a beloved child of God, that you are not disordered, that you are not unnatural, basic things like 2,000 species of creatures that the divine created on this planet practice some sort of non-heterosexual sexual activity, makes us utterly natural, utterly mundane in the scope of sexuality across and gender also across species. And so those kinds of things, that there's information that has been withheld from us. There are specific interpretations of the Bible that we have not been allowed to access. For example, all of the places in the Bible where God is a feminine creature, a feminine being. We have endless numbers where God is both plural as well as singular, where God is not just a he, not just masculine. We have gender diversity in the Bible where it has never been and is not now male and female only. And there are examples of that in the Bible. There are examples of love between people of the same sex or same gender that are there, and they are all available to us if we have been given all the information. But rather, because of who was looking at the text, who was interpreting the tradition, and who had power and wanted to keep it, those things have been withheld from us. And therefore, part of our work around womanist theology, feminist theology, mujerista theology, and queer and trans theologies, which are just exploding right now in terms of their proliferation and their reach, help to do that, to say, it does matter who's reading the text. It does matter that we listen for the voice of the divine in the tradition, in our history, because we've always been here and we've always been part of culture. And there is a reason why we haven't heard those stories. And so that is our duty for those of us who cling to the Christian faith.
Thank you, Alba. And is Simon Hill there? And Adam, are you able to bring him in, or shall I just read out his question? I'm going to give a couple moments to see if that's a technological possibility. And Adam, can you bring Simon in? Is he coming? I've got Kimeo telling us that that was deep, Reverend Alba. I'm going to.
Sorry, Adam, I can't, unfortunately.
Okay, so we can't bring Simon in, but I think he's there. But Simon sent in a question in advance, which I'm going to ask on his behalf, which is, what can queer Christians in the UK do to offer solidarity to our queer siblings in Kenya, Uganda, and elsewhere? I'm going to start by going to Arya with that.
Well, so there's a couple of things, and the first one is something maybe Chrissy has mentioned, that it's easier to fund, for lack of a better word, Christian extremism in Africa than it is to like really practice it in the States or in Europe. And I think the first thing is to push for such funding to be cut off, because you realize in Kenya, if we have gay conversion center, it's not funded from Kenya, it's funded from Europe, it's funded from the States. And then, so that could be the very first step. Then I think the second thing that I could think of is, again, well, maybe again, just to push this whole idea of, because in Kenya, if you speak about, oh, you know, I'm queer and I'm also religious, or I'm queer and I believe in some sort of, you know, divine, and everyone, people from the mainstream religion tell you, you know, you're not welcome here, you should go start your own church. And the thing is, it's not about the difficulty in starting a church or a congregation. The challenge is, once you step out, they still retain the right to say, you know, you're a wrong kind of person. And this is what this whole discussion is about, that whatever faith, whether it's Islam or the Catholic faith or what, then a queer person has a right to practice that faith, and they actually belong to whatever faith they decide to join in. And no one has the moral standing to tell them, you know, you can't be in this. And maybe it's easier for people in, because I've seen one of the questions, someone said Quakers are very welcoming, but that's not the case here. It's the case in Europe and in the States. When they come here, even the missionaries, they just have to, you know, blend in with other societies, and the society is anti-LGBT, so you will not start speaking up on behalf of LGBT people. And it's so interesting to see the dynamic, because even in, so a lot of the queer community organizing here have projects they do with the government and with some religious societies. And in these projects, you'll actually see a clergy, you know, priests, sheikhs, reverends come for project work with a queer person, but they do not want you to attend their church. They will say, you know, you can come to church, but don't let anyone know what you are. And the thing is, that's already asking you to come to church, but change who you are. You're not accepted as you are. But they'll come and do the project work with you because it's giving them some, you know, donor funding and some money for their church. And I find these double standards. And it's the same with government. We have a lot of funding coming in for, you know, HIV/AIDS projects. And a lot of these, like the Global Fund, it has to be something that's discussed between faith-based organizations, government organizations, and then they put all these other outsider groups into one group they call a key population. which is sex workers, gay men, and as of last year, they included transgender persons. And the thing is, for the purpose of this whole getting this funding that comes from Global Fund, which is about 4.3 billion Kenya shillings, government officers will work with you. Faith-based people, again, reverends, clergy, theologians will work with you just on the HIV project. But when you actually need them to speak up for you, like in court, like last year, none of these people, none of the medics, the government medics who've been working on HIV projects with queer folk came to say, you know, this is actually not even valid. But we had clergy, we had Kenya Christian Doctors Association. It's a front again for medics who, when they speak, they don't speak from medical terms, they speak based on their, you know, their warped Christian faith. We had some of these signing affidavits in court saying that being gay or being lesbian could be changed medically. And so again, double standard. So this project, and I think, so queer Christians in the UK could hold, and in the US, wherever funding is coming from, they should hold accountable the people receiving this funding. So if they're sending funding for HIV/AIDS, and the government and the faith-based organizations are claiming to work with queer people, they should actually sign up to some set of principles and say, yeah, we will respect, we will actually work with them as they are, and we'll work to advance their human rights in other opportunities. Because as the situation is right now, they will just come in and work for the money and then move on with their life. And sometimes when they have opportunity to out the queer persons, because they've met in the projects, but out there they're not responsible to anyone, and they say, oh, that one is, you know, gay, that one is, you know, transgender and stuff like that. So you're actually outed by the same faith-based, the same government officers who are receiving funding from Europe, the States, to do HIV work with you. So it's such double standards. And I think, you know, just speaking up and bringing these, you know, very nuanced factors and issues to the fore and to light, I think that's what maybe people outside of this space can do. So yeah.
May I speak briefly to UK Christianity and pose a question to Arya? So I feel like I have a little bit of an investment, a personal investment in the Church of England, because I briefly tried to be Episcopalian. I was actually confirmed Episcopalian in 2012. I guess I still am on paper. I'm not going to bother to get myself kicked out, and I don't even know if they have a process of kicking people out, so whatever, I don't particularly care. But I have been very disappointed with both Rowan Williams and Justin Welby and their refusal to take a robust stance, you know, for LGBTQ inclusion in the faith, and instead to do what I see as kowtowing to you know, conservative leaders abroad in the former empire, who you know, are now saying that, you know, they would leave the Anglican Communion if the Anglican Communion takes a strong position on LGBTQ inclusion. And I have also been disappointed with the American Episcopal leadership, maybe not to the same extent, but I mean, part of the reason Episcopalianism didn't work for me, there are many reasons, but one of the reasons is that I don't really have any use for big tents that include people who think I should be dead. So, you know, what do you think about what maybe Christians in the UK could do to simply try to hold the Church of England and through them, the Anglican Communion accountable? Is this a wrong-headed thing? Would this be good or bad for, you know, all of you on the ground in Africa?
Well, I mean, so one of the reasons for this article was to make, you know, the regular Christian who goes to church, says their prayers, and it's to help them think deeper, because when they're told you need to hate LGBT people, they just take it. They believe exactly every word they're told. When they're told you need to give funds for a conversion therapy project in Africa, they just give the money. And so one of the things was hoping that this article generate is that whole discussion of, maybe we were wrong. Maybe this whole anti-LGBT thing was King Henry fighting the Catholics, and he started it to get at the priest. Or maybe, this was about the British themselves trying to, keep the empire. So this was the discussion I was hoping that would rise from it, that people will start questioning the beginnings of hate and just look at the religion from, pure principles. If I'm supposed to love other human beings, it's just pure humanism. Love a person for being human. And once regular Christians start looking at their faith in this way, then they can start questioning where they're putting their money. Because if you look at Kenya, the current, I know the Catholic Church right now runs a center, a gay conversion center. And this is ironically funded by Anglican non-profit in the UK. So there's all these relationships and they don't even make sense. But once the Christian who gives the money to this not-for-profit starts questioning their own individual faith, then we can cut the source of that money. And Christians can actually start asking, what kind of project am I giving my cash to? And what benefits are coming out of it? So that's really, that's what this article is supposed to do, just give everyday regular Christians power in their hands to question their scriptures and actually question things which they're told are correct, and say, maybe my money shouldn't be used to target someone who loves differently. And so I will not give it for that cause, I will use it for this other cause. And such personal decisions.
And so I want to say I absolutely agree with you on, the issue of advocating for this kind of robust religious freedom, right? Religious freedom that is applied equally and not unequally as it is typically also applied in the United States, particularly with respect to recent Supreme Court cases. So I think reclaiming religious freedom is a really good approach. But I want to just ask you kind of point blank for your take on this. Do you think that the Church of England should just take a strong stand on LGBTQ inclusion and let the chips fall and let maybe certain African churches in the Anglican Communion break away in schism, or would that actually be a bad outcome? Would it do more harm than good?
It will do absolute good, because, and not just the Church of England. I mean, the Church of England should absolutely do it now that they have accepted gay clergy. So they just need that one more step of saying, we are LGBT accepting community. They should do that. And we should also start asking it of other, communions and faiths. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican City has no LGBT criminalization laws, but why would they allow their bishop to come as someone in court to actually ask for people to continue being imprisoned for 14 years just for loving differently? So we should have that from leaderships of, whether they're in England or whether in the Vatican City. The Pope should be like, oh, in my country, the state of Vatican, I have no laws criminalizing LGBT people. Why are you, Bishop Alfred Rotich, my bishop, going to court to ask people to be oppressed? So so long as the churches have this hierarchy that goes back out of Africa, then it's the responsibility of their leadership that's also out of Africa to say, the world moved on from this particular state of being. And while it still works for some power dynamics, because it really works in Africa, if you want to get into power, you have to look a certain way. You have to be the family man. You have to tick all those boxes. You have to attend multiple churches and look very religious, and you will get the votes. Even if you've killed a bunch of people to get the votes, people still say, he's a church person. And so church leadership that's out of Africa should start calling out and saying, yeah, we've done past wrongs, but now we recognize that the world has moved and we should be moving towards a more humane world, a world that's based on what's best for a human being. So yes, they totally should. They totally should call out declare their stand, let there be a split or a schism or whatever it is, and yeah, let the chips fall.
Cool, thank you, Arya. We have about 1 minute left. I'm going to come to Alba in that minute, and I'm hoping that you can give us some final words of hope for what's happening in the struggle over Christianity, both in America and around the world.
Whew. The thing that gives me the most hope is seeing people like Arya and other folks all across the world, because as soon as we recognize each other, when we see each other, when we start learning all the things that seem to not make sense and then they make sense, we find family. I certainly found family in Kenya. I found family on this call. I am so delighted by the possibility that whether from a Christian perspective or outside of Christianity, that we can all collectively understand that we are worthy of dignity and life and love just as we are. And that is plenty for us to push back against systems, denominations, infrastructures that seek us harm. We know who we are.
Thank you. We have been Open Democracy. We've been Chrissy Stroop, Arya Karijo, Alba Onofrio. I loved that chat. I hope that you guys all did too. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us. The conversation will continue online and on Open Democracy. We've got lots more stuff on this lined up. If you want to hear more from us, then please do sign up to our newsletter. Just go to opendemocracy.net/newsletter. If you want to continue to have these sorts of conversations, then we need to continue to have media like Open Democracy, which means I'm afraid we need your money. So please do donate at the link that's been provided, opendemocracy.net/support. We shall be doing this again next week. We'll have another conversation, and Adam is going to put the link in the chat now for the conversation. I think it's opendemocracy.net/live-discussions. And thank you all so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening or morning or afternoon or night, depending where you are in the world. And if you believe in them, then God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.